Welcome to MyCounselor.Online. In today's video, we're going to be talking through an article about low sex drive among women. I'm here with Josh Spurlock, and he is going to answer some questions for us. Josh, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Glad to be here with you, Tori.
Awesome. So today I am going to ask Josh some questions about this article. Josh, can you explain kind of what low sex drive is and what it kind of looks like, specifically among women?
Yeah, it's a good question. It seems simple enough and straightforward enough, but it's really more complex than it sounds on the surface because we have the statement low sexual desire assumes a measure or a norm of some sort out there, right? Like, how do we know if it's low or if it's high compared to what? And so there's this comparison that's inherent within the statement of there's a kind of desire, a level of desire, frequency that I'm supposed to want or desire. And that standard, a lot of times, is set by an expectation of male sexual desire.
Mm.
And so we think about the frequency in which men experience what we call initiating desire. That is that sense of, I feel horny, I feel the subjective sense of arousal that motivates me to pursue connecting sexually. And so if we look at that definition of sexual desire, and then we look at the frequency at which men experience that, and then take that as a standard and say, how do women compare to that? Then we're going to consistently find that nearly all women have low sexual desire by that standard.
Right.
But is that really the standard that we should be using to measure female sexual desire? Is that really, are women supposed to be men? Are they supposed to be like men in their experience of sexual desire? And the answer to that is no. That God made men and women different. They experience their sexuality different. And so using a standard that measures female sexuality against male sexuality really isn't an accurate or good way to think about sexual desire. So probably the more helpful way to think about it is a desire conflict, right? That when does sexual desire or a mismatch in levels of sexual desire create conflict within the relationship? Because if it's not creating concern for the woman and it's not creating conflict within the relationship, then who really cares what the level's at? And it doesn't really matter. It's just a matter of personal preference of sorts. It's insignificant. And so more significant is the level of desire that you experience, creating some conflict for either you internally or concern for you internally, or is it creating some conflict within your relationship? Is there a mismatch between you and your spouse in a way that's creating conflict? And the reality of conflict around sexual desire within a relationship is really prevalent. That the research would show that in about 80% of relationships that men experience, the husbands experience a higher rate of initiating desire than their spouse. That their want to pursue and connecting in the connecting sexually is higher than the wives. In about 20% of relationships, the wife's desire for connecting sexually is higher than the husband's. And if you do the math on 80% plus 20%, what you come up with is in about 100% of couples, the desire is different between husband and wife. And either because the wives is higher than the husbands or the husband's higher than the wives, but there's a presence of a difference. Very few couples is it exactly the same all the time. So almost all couples have to navigate differences in sexual desire. And that's really what we're looking to figure out. we want to identify, is there a difference there? What kind of conflict does that create for us? And how do we navigate that difference in a way that feels good to both of us? And if we have a lower sexual desire than we want to have in the relationship, what might be the things that are getting in the way of that?
Right, right. Well said. Um, how often are you seeing couples and clients coming to My Counselor Online with these kinds of issues?
Yeah, we see them every day. Every day we're working with couples, either that come in specifically because they're having conflict around desired differences in the relationship, or we're doing work around other marital matters. And as we resolve those things, the topic of differences in sexual desire then becomes part of the dialogue that we're having.
Right. So this is a common occurrence among women.
Completely, yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned in the article 10 reasons that this might be happening among women. So one of the things that you mentioned is the hormone cycle. So I would love if you could kind of talk about that, give a little more information about the hormone cycle and how that can increase or decrease sexual drive.
Yeah, so female sexuality is complex. We talk about sometimes in talks that we'll give at churches or different places, the difference between male and female sexuality. And the illustration for male sexuality is kind of like the Staples easy button, right? That's the slide that comes up on the screen, big red button, you press it, and that was easy. Male sexuality tends to be really consistent and relatively unaffected by uh, features that aren't extreme in terms of life circumstances. Whereas female sexuality is a lot more complex. The word picture or the illustration for that might be the cockpit of a 747 jet. There's all sorts of dials and knobs and doodads that are part of flying that machine. And female sexuality is influenced uh, in a significant way by the chemical balance that's going on inside our body, which fluctuates day to day, week to week within your life. And so the it's a really normal experience in a stable relationship. That is, once we're 18 months or so into marriage, and we're from 3 to 18 months, for the new hormones, the new relationship hormones, the excitement, the kind of dopamine driven sexual interactions between a couple kind of level off. And for the initiating desire, that kind of hormonal push that says, I just out of the blue feel the desire to connect sexually with my husband, for that to be related to ovulation and to be something that's experienced a few days a month around ovulation. And that's just a normal part of female biology and hormones and how that influences and affects a sexuality.
Right. It's an incredible design, honestly. When I think of myself as a woman and, the way that our bodies were designed to be in ovulation and kind of have that maybe higher sex drive at that time of the month, it really is an incredible design and just reminds me, that God intended for sex to be this beautiful, pleasurable, purposeful thing. Um, so let's talk about another reason that you mentioned for low sex drive. You mentioned trauma. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that might influence that in women?
Yeah. One of the big things to understand about trauma as it pertains to our sexual relationship is trauma is a lot broader than we tend to think of it as. As therapists, we think in terms of what we call big T trauma and little t trauma. Big T trauma tends to be the sort of things that we think of intuitively when we think of trauma, like someone experiencing a rape or experiencing incest or sexual abuse as a child growing up. That there's an experience like that that just is blaring, stands out and says this was a traumatic kind of negative experience that involved my body and sexuality in some way that then pairs the negative emotional experiences of that trauma with my sexuality. That then later, as I'm engaging my sexual self in relationship, because of the connection between that significantly distressful experience and its relatedness to my sexuality, that is then triggered and comes out and gets in the way of me being able to be present and enjoy my sexuality. But it's not always kind of a big T trauma experience, that there's a lot of experiences that we can have that are much less apparent, that can still have a real negative influence around our sexuality. Things like unwanted sexual attention, that we can be engaged, gawked at, have language used around our body, around sexuality, that leaves us feeling really uncomfortable, either scared or disgusted, or just having a negative experience around my body and my sexuality, that then creates an association between my body and sexuality and that negative emotional experience. You know? Unwanted touch, whether that be in a locker room setting or from a high school boy in the hallway, or from a feeling pressure sexually in a relationship, or acting and engaging sexually in ways that are inconsistent with your values in a sexual relationship, that create negative, anxious, stressful experience around body and sexuality. All of those things can come back to interfere with our ability to be present and connected with and enjoy our body and sexuality within our marriage.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then another reason that you mention is sex being considered dirty. And I think that that is something that probably many women in the church can understand and relate to. So if you could just emphasize a little bit more about us viewing this misconception that sex equals dirty, and what that looks like in marriage.
Absolutely. It's another common experience that gals that have grown up in church have absorbed from a distorted ideas around purity. Not that purity is a bad thing or an unbiblical thing, but there are unintentional messages and sometimes intentional messages that are communicated through church culture that's kind of reactionary to a secular mindset around sexuality, that sends the message that sexuality, experiencing sexual desire, being a sexual creature, is in itself kind of inherently dirty, bad, slutty, not something that a good Christian girl experiences or desires or has as part of their experience. And so there's this shame and negative connotation that can get associated with one's own experiencing of themselves as a sexual creature, that then leads us to feel the need to, in the name of pleasing God, to try to deny and shut down part of that design nature that God has put into us, He's wired into us. That somehow we see this aspect of our biology that God's created and gifted us with as somehow being displeasing to Him. And so that creates this bind and conflict that causes us to need to, out of our want to be pleasing to our Creator, to really suppress and disconnect from this part of our experience that He gave us. That then later makes it difficult to reconnect with that. And it's not like you get married and a switch flips and all of that effort and energy that has gone into disconnecting from that part of your experience is undone in an instant, because I put a ring on a finger and said I do. And so now all of that's years of working to disconnect from those things has now passed. One of the most confusing things for folks around this, though, is couples will come into my office and they'll say, Josh, man, as we were dating, that I had all sorts of sexual desire. Like we couldn't keep our hands off of each other, and that like we felt this strong sexual desire. And then we got into the marriage, and 3 months in, and it just kind of like was gone. What happened? And so it creates this confusion around how could those things, in terms of the messaging that I got from my upbringing or from church culture or from my efforts around kind of disconnecting from my sexual desire, how could that then be an influence on me if while I was dating, it didn't seem to be an influence on me? And the answer to that is really kind of related to that earlier topic that we talked about around the hormones of our body and the chemicals within our body. That when we're in a new relationship and we're in that kind of excitement phase of relationship, there's a different set of hormones in the body that really drive those interactions. It's a adrenaline and dopamine driven interaction that supercharges that sexual arousal and desire and connection. And when you get stabilized within a relationship, the hormones that regulate kind of sexual desire and interaction shift to an oxytocin based relational driven connection instead of dopamine and adrenaline. And so, in the absence of that dopamine and adrenaline supercharging that sexual desire, the difficulties that were there before but covered up by the dopamine and adrenaline response within the body appear and are the troubles that we then start dealing with once we get into marriage.
Right. And I definitely see how when you're married, it can change and things shift, and you're probably around each other all the time, and it can definitely shift that part of your relationship. And you mentioned multiple reasons throughout the article. You mentioned lack of emotional connection. You mentioned all of these different things, busyness, and feeling like you don't have time to have sex. You're so busy with each other and with friends and with Bible studies and all of these different things. You're just like, I can't do this right now. Which is such a shift from being in a relationship and having just such high desire to be with each other 24/7. So my question to you would be, is this treatable? Is this list of things treatable? Are these things that we can fix, both as a couple and individually as a woman?
Absolutely. Absolutely, without question. That each of the items in this 10 item list that we talked through are things that we routinely see on a common basis, and there's answers to each of them. That when you work with a sex therapist, one of the things that they do is assess what is behind the difficulties that we're facing. That we know the right questions to ask to be able to identify what is causing this specific difficulty that this couple is having. That when it comes to, say, low sexual desire, mismatched sexual desire, it could be, like is shown in the article, any number of different things that are contributing to that. Being able to narrow down and figure out which one it is, and then put together a treatment plan that allows us to address the pieces that are driving that, really does allow couples to reach their goals and to get back to a place of really enjoying their sex life in a way that feels good to both of them and is exactly what God designed for them.
I love that. Very well said. And what is something that you would want a woman or a couple reading this article together to take away from it?
Yeah, I would hope that you would feel hopeful.
Mm.
That as you're reading through the list of different common causes for that difficulty that couples have, that you would maybe see yourself in one or two of them and dive into the articles that are behind them and be able to be encouraged that you're not alone and that there are answers to troubleshooting and figuring out the difficulty that you're having that can enable you to have the kind of connection that you really long for.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we encourage you to go and read this article in the description below, and be encouraged that you're not alone, and that this is all treatable, all 10 reasons. And we hope that you feel no shame about it, and that you're able to talk about it with your spouse and with a sex therapist if you feel like you need that. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.